6 weeks in the hospital after a stroke, and my daughter never once picked up the phone. The morning they discharged me, I had $43 in my wallet, a bag of clothes that smelled like antiseptic, and a text message that said, "Dad, I'm swamped today. Just grab an Uber." I stood outside the discharge entrance of Mercy General in Tucson, Arizona on a Tuesday morning in February. The desert air was cold the way it gets in February. Not the brutal cold of the Midwest, but the kind that surprises you, that you're never quite dressed for. I was wearing the same flannel shirt and khaki pants I'd been admitted in 6 weeks ago. My shoes were still crusted with the dirt from my driveway. The nurses had kept everything in a plastic bag. I looked at my daughter's text message for a long time. Then I looked at the Uber app. The ride home would cost $38. That would leave me $5. I didn't have a credit card anymore. Not since the medical bills started stacking up 2 years ago after my wife passed. I sat down on the bench outside the sliding glass doors and watched the world go on without me. A man in his 40s helped his elderly mother into a minivan, buckling her seatbelt like she was something precious. A young father carried a newborn in a car seat, one hand gripping the handle like his whole life was in it. I watched all of it. I had nowhere to be. My daughter lived 22 minutes from the hospital. I had checked that morning on Google Maps, the way you check things when you're hoping to be wrong. I tried calling her a second time. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Her voice on the recording sounded warm and professional. "You've reached Vanessa. Leave me a message and I'll get back to you soon." I didn't leave a message. What would I have said? I'd been sitting there for almost 2 hours when a man sat down at the other end of the bench. He was maybe 50, broad-shouldered, wearing a good jacket and carrying a laptop bag. He glanced at me, then looked again, more carefully. "Excuse me," he said. "Are you Harold Busby?" I looked at him. He had a kind face, the kind that comes from living through things and surviving them. "Yeah," I said. "That's me." He leaned forward, and something changed in his expression. Something quiet and grateful. I thought so. I wasn't sure at first. "It's been a long time." He extended his hand. "My name is Lester Crane. 12 years ago, you gave me a job at your hardware store when I was about to lose everything." I stared at him. The name came back slowly, the way things come back when you're 67 and your brain is still rewiring itself from a stroke. Lester. The young man had shown up at Busby's Hardware on a rainy November morning asking if I had anything at all. Sweeping, unloading trucks, anything. He'd been 38, recently divorced, 2 kids in Phoenix he was trying to get back to. I'd hired him, kept him for 3 years until his life got sorted out. "Lester," I said, "you look well." "I am well," he said. "I went back to school after I left your store. Got my paralegal certificate, then my law degree. I've been practicing in Tucson for about 4 years now." He paused, looking at my bag at the hospital behind us. Are you all right?" I opened my mouth to say yes, to give the answer I'd been trained to give by 67 years of being a man in America. But I was sitting on a bench outside a hospital with $43 and a daughter who was busy. "Not really," I said. He nodded slowly. "Is someone coming to get you?" I looked at my phone. The screen had gone dark. "No," I said. "I don't think so." Lester stood up without another word and held out his hand. "Let me drive you home." I didn't argue. There was nothing left to argue with. His car was a dark green sedan, clean and well kept. He opened the door for me. I gave him my address, out on the east side, off Old Spanish Trail, where my wife Lorraine and I had lived for 31 years in a house with a half-acre lot and a workshop I'd built myself. We drove mostly in silence. The desert rolled past the windows, the saguaro standing tall against the pale morning sky. I watched them and thought about Lorraine, the way she used to love this drive, the way she said Arizona was the only place in America where the sky felt honest. "Your daughter," Lester said carefully after a while. "She couldn't make it today." "She's busy," I said. He didn't press. He was smart enough not to press. When we turned onto my street, I felt something sink in my chest before I could even understand why. My house was dark. February morning, nobody home, that was normal. But as we pulled into the driveway, I saw the mailbox overflowing, circulars and envelopes spilling out onto the ground. The lawn was overgrown. A recycling bin had tipped over in the wind. The garden hose was still stretched across the front walk where I'd left it 6 weeks ago. Nobody had been here. Not once. Lester pulled into the driveway and turned off the engine. We sat there. How long did you say you were in the hospital? He asked. 6 weeks. Neither of us said what that meant. Inside, the power was off. The refrigerator held things I didn't want to look at. The mail on the kitchen table was 4 inches high. And when I walked to the door of my workshop, the small detached building in the backyard where I'd spent 30 years building furniture, where Lorraine used to bring me coffee on Saturday mornings and sit on the old stool and talk to me while I worked, the door was locked with a new padlock I had never seen before. I didn't put that lock there. I stood in the backyard in the February cold, holding my plastic hospital bag and staring at a lock on my own workshop, and I felt something in me go very still. Lester came up beside me. He looked at the lock, then at me. He didn't say anything. He just put a hand on my shoulder and stood there. You're staying tonight, I said. It wasn't a question. Yes, he said, I am. He slept on the couch. I didn't sleep at all. Lester was a real estate attorney, but he knew enough about elder law to know what he was looking at. The next morning, once the power company had restored service and we'd aired out the worst of the smell, he sat down at my kitchen table with the box of documents I pulled from the hall closet, bank statements, insurance papers, the deed to the house. He was quiet for a long time. Then he found the document that changed everything. Harold, he said, when did you sign this? He handed me a piece of paper. At the top, in bold letters, durable power of attorney. I read it. My name was on it. My signature was at the bottom, but it was shaky and wrong-looking, like a child's attempt to copy something they'd seen. The date was 6 days after I was admitted to the hospital. I had been on blood thinners and a medication for swelling in my brain. I'd spent most of that first week sleeping. My daughter came, I said slowly. She visited that first week. She brought papers. She said it was so she could pay my bills while I was recovering, just to make things easier. Lester looked at me steadily. This isn't a bill-paying authorization, Harold. This is full legal authority over your finances, your property, your medical decisions, everything. She said it was just paperwork. She lied. The word hit the room like something thrown. My daughter's name was Vanessa. She was 41. A real estate agent in Scottsdale, married to a man named Cliff who had the handshake of someone who needed you to know he was important. I had loved her the way you love someone who has been difficult to love, steadily, completely, with a kind of exhausted devotion. After Lorraine died, I thought we were getting closer. I thought grief had done that, softened the edges between us. I was wrong. Lester spent 3 days going through my documents. He found things I hadn't known to look for. A second mortgage on my property, signed 2 weeks after my stroke, using the power of attorney as authorization, $180,000, secured against the house Lorraine and I had paid off completely 4 years ago. The proceeds had been transferred to an account I didn't recognize. A property appraisal, ordered by an authorized representative, estimating the house and workshop at $520,000. 3 withdrawals from my savings account totaling $27,000. I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the numbers and thought about Lorraine. She would have known. She always knew things about Vanessa that I didn't let myself see. Lester called a friend of his, a private investigator named Bart Winslow, who specialized in financial fraud. Bart was in his mid-50s, the kind of man who moves through the world quietly and noticed everything. He spent a week and came back with a folder. Vanessa and Cliff were in debt. Our restaurant venture in Scottsdale had collapsed 2 years before, leaving them $340,000 in the hole to a private investor who was not being patient about it. The $180,000 from my house plus the savings withdrawals had gone toward keeping that debt from going to collections. I was funding the failure they hadn't told me about. Bart scrolled through his phone and showed me Vanessa's Instagram page. 58,000 followers. Lifestyle content, Scottsdale restaurants, spa days, weekend trips to Sedona. In the 6 weeks I'd been in the hospital, she had posted 14 times. Not once about me, but in the week I was admitted, she posted 2 photos taken in the hospital lobby. Not my room, the lobby, with captions full of prayer hands, emojis, and family first, and so grateful Dad is a fighter. Those posts had gotten thousands of likes. She hadn't made it upstairs to see me. I didn't say anything when Bart showed me that. I just closed the folder and set it down on the table. The padlock on the workshop was new. Lester's best guess was that Vanessa had put it there to keep me from accessing documents or tools she thought might interfere with whatever she was planning next. Or maybe she just didn't want me in there. I had been building a roll-top desk in that workshop. I'd been building it for 2 years, slowly, as a gift for my grandson, who was 9 years old and already showed a love of things made with hands. The desk was about 60% finished. I didn't tell Lester about the desk. Some things you just carry. The next morning, my phone rang. Vanessa. I answered. Dad. Her voice was careful, controlled. I got an alert that the power was restored at the house. Are you home? Yes. I got discharged yesterday. A pause. Why didn't you call me? I did. Twice. Another pause, shorter this time, recalibrating. I'm so sorry, Dad. It's been crazy. How are you feeling? I found the power of attorney you had me sign in the ICU. The silence that followed was different from the others. It had weight in it. Dad, that was just to protect you while you were. You took out a mortgage on my house. We need it. She stopped herself. That money was to help stabilize our situation so we could actually be there for you going forward. Cliff and I have been under enormous stress. You locked the workshop. The workshop is dangerous for someone recovering from a stroke. Power tools, sawdust. Vanessa. I kept my voice even. I have an attorney reviewing everything. His name is Lester Crane. If you want to discuss next steps, you can call him. She hung up. 30 minutes later, she called back. This time her voice had changed entirely. Low, careful, a little wounded. Dad, I don't understand why you're doing this. After everything I've done. And then she said it, I'm worried about your cognitive state since the stroke. I've talked to your doctor and there are signs that you might not be making fully sound decisions. I care about you. That's why I did what I did. I recognized it for what it was. I just hadn't expected to recognize it so clearly. I'll have Lester's number sent to you, I said, and ended the call. That evening, Lester told me about a medication question that had been sitting in the back of his mind since the day before. He'd been looking at my prescriptions, the blood thinners, the stroke prevention protocol, and one of the bottles looked wrong. The pills were a different color from what my neurologist had prescribed. He called a pharmacist friend of his in Phoenix, a woman named Dr. Okafor, who had a background in forensic pharmacology and owed Lester a favor from a case a few years back. She agreed to look at them. 2 days later, she called back. The pills in the bottle labeled as my blood pressure medication were not blood pressure medication. They were a generic calcium supplement over the counter. No active therapeutic compounds. My blood pressure had not been controlled for an unknown number of weeks. That was a significant contributing factor to the type of stroke I'd had. I sat with that information for a long time. Lester sat across from me at the kitchen table and didn't try to fill the silence. My daughter had refilled my prescription in November. She'd offered, said she was passing by the pharmacy anyway, said it was the least she could do. I'd thanked her for it. I thought about November. I'd been having headaches, dizzy spells. I'd mentioned it to Vanessa once and she'd said, Dad, you're getting older. That's just how it is. The stroke had happened in December. Lester spoke first. This is reckless endangerment at minimum. Depending on what the Maricopa County DA's office thinks of it, it could be more serious. I didn't answer. I was looking out the window in my dark workshop. Harold. I know, I said. We sat there in my kitchen with the desert getting cold outside, and I thought about my daughter as a little girl, the way she used to come find me in the workshop on Saturday afternoons and sit on that same stool Lorraine would use, asking me questions about whatever I was building, genuinely curious. I had loved those afternoons. I had loved her so completely. I thought about the last conversation I'd had with Lorraine before she got sick. We'd been sitting on the porch, and she'd said something I hadn't understood at the time, Harold. I think we made it too easy for her. I don't know what to do about it, but I think we did. I told her she was being too hard on herself, that Vanessa was fine, that she just had a different way of showing love. Lorraine had looked at me with that patient expression she sometimes got, the one that meant you'll understand later. I thought she was just tired. 3 months after that conversation, she was diagnosed. I went to her filing cabinet that evening, the one in the corner of the living room she'd used for household records. I hadn't touched it since she passed. I'd been telling myself I would, that eventually I'd go through it, but there was always something else to do and it was easier not to. The top two drawers were what I expected: utility records, tax returns, insurance documents. In the bottom drawer, beneath a folder of old Christmas card lists, there was an envelope. My name on the front. Lorraine's handwriting. I held it for a long time. Lester was in the kitchen making coffee. I brought the envelope in and set it on the table between us. "It's from my wife," I said. He looked at it, then at me. "Do you want privacy?" "No," I said. "Stay." I broke the seal carefully. Inside was 2 pages of Lorraine's handwriting on the blue stationery she'd used for letters since the 1980s. "Harold, if you're reading this, I am gone. And I'm sorry I didn't find a better time to tell you what I'm going to tell you. I've been trying to tell you for years. But every time I tried, you'd get that look on your face. The one that says we'll already have your mind made up, and I lose my nerve. I have to tell you about Vanessa and the money. 3 years ago, before I got sick, I found something in the mail. A credit card statement in your name, on an account I didn't recognize. The balance was $31,000. I confronted Vanessa. She cried. She said Cliff had been in trouble, that she'd taken out the card in your name without telling you because she was desperate and didn't know what else to do. She promised you would pay it off. She promised you would pay it off again. I closed the account. I paid it off from my own savings account, the one you didn't know about, the one I'd been keeping for 30 years just in case. I told Vanessa it was her one chance. I made her swear. Harold, I should have told you. I've been telling myself I was protecting you, protecting our family, but the truth is, I was afraid of what it would mean. I was afraid of what you'd see if you looked too closely. She's done it before. She'll do it again. That's not a terrible thing to say about our daughter. It's just the truth, and you deserve to know it. Please don't make the same mistake I made. Don't cover for her. Don't excuse it. I loved her so much that I thought love could fix what only consequences could fix. It can't. Love you always, Lorraine. I set the letter down. Lester didn't speak. He just sat there and let me be in the room with it. I thought about Lorraine paying off $31,000 in secret from savings I didn't know she had. I thought about her carrying that for 3 years, right up until she died. I thought about that last porch conversation, her saying, "I think we made it too easy for her," and me telling her she was wrong. She hadn't been wrong. She'd been carrying the proof of it the whole time. She knew, I said. "Yes," Lester said. And Vanessa let her die knowing. He didn't answer that. There wasn't an answer. We took everything to the Pima County Attorney's office 2 days later. The contact Lester had was a prosecutor named Ellen Marsh, sharp, methodical, with 15 years of experience in financial crimes. She reviewed the documents with the particular stillness of someone who had seen worse and was not impressed by Vanessa and Cliff's level of creativity. "The medication tampering is the most serious piece," she said. "The fraud is prosecutable, but medication interference that contributes to a medical event, that's where this becomes something much bigger." She opened an investigation. That same afternoon, Vanessa filed an emergency guardianship petition claiming that I was suffering cognitive decline post-stroke and was being manipulated by Lester. Her filing included a letter from a neurologist I had never met. A doctor, Tim Bellows, who stated that I exhibited confusion and impaired judgment inconsistent with safe, independent living. Lester called the neurologist's office. There was no record of an appointment. No visit, no examination, no file. Just a letter. Bart ran a quick background and found Dr. Bellows in 2 Instagram photos on Cliff's account from a golf weekend in Scottsdale 8 months prior. They were friends. The letter was fabricated. Vanessa also started posting about me. Carefully worded, full of concern. "Dad's recovery has been so hard to watch. He doesn't seem like himself lately. Grateful for the people looking out for him." The comments filled with prayer hands from her followers. Half of them didn't know she had a father. The guardianship hearing was scheduled for 14 days out. Lester brought in a geriatric psychiatrist named Dr. Francis Webb, who had testified in over 100 competency hearings and was not someone you wanted on the other side. She evaluated me for 3 hours at my kitchen table. Cognitive tests, memory exercises, spatial reasoning, verbal fluency. At the end, she set down her pen and said, "Mr. Busby, your cognition is intact. Your stroke affected your left side briefly, but your mental function is sound. I will say so clearly in court." On day 12, Vanessa and Cliff showed up at my door. Cliff was carrying a brochure for a facility called Saguaro Springs Assisted Living. Premium care for discerning seniors. He had the look of a man running a closing pitch. "Dad," Vanessa said, stepping past me into the entryway, "we need to talk about next steps. You can't manage this house on your own anymore. You almost died." "I did not almost die," I said. "I had a stroke. I'm recovered." "Dad." Her voice dropped, gentled, the way it did when she was about to say something she'd practiced. "I know this is hard to hear, but Cliff and I have been talking to specialists, and the consensus is that independent living post-stroke at your age. You replace my blood pressure medication with calcium supplements." The room went quiet. Cliff looked at Vanessa. Vanessa looked at the floor, a split second too long. "That's not, Dad, that's not what." Dr. Okafor analyzed the pills. The pharmacy confirmed they dispensed the correct medication when you picked them up in November. The pills in my bottle were not the correct medication. I waited. "You had my prescription. You had my house keys. You were the only one who had both." Cliff turned to Vanessa. "We should go." "You should," Lester said from the kitchen doorway, "and you should contact your attorneys before you say anything else." Vanessa looked at me, and for a second I saw something real in her face. Not guilt exactly. Something more complicated. Something like the moment you realize the story you've been telling yourself no longer holds. Then she left. 2 weeks later, the guardianship hearing. Judge Carolyn Pruitt, a woman in her 60s with a reputation for patience in complicated cases and zero patience for bad faith. She reviewed the evidence calmly. She dismissed Dr. Bill's letter with 4 words: unsupported, unverified, inadmissible, and referred his conduct to the state medical board. She heard Dr. Webb's testimony. She read through Lester's documentation of the POA, the mortgage fraud, the medication analysis. Then she asked me to speak. I stood up and I talked for about 4 minutes. I talked about Lorraine's letter. I read the part where Lorraine said love does not fix what only consequences can fix. I talked about what it meant to sit on a bench outside Mercy General with $43 and a text message saying, "Grab an Uber." I talked about what I was asking the court to do and why. Judge Pruitt listened without moving. Then I read the relevant section of my updated will, drawn up 2 weeks earlier with a different attorney, which left my house and property in a living trust administered by Lester, with instructions that the workshop and its contents go to my grandson once he turned 18, on the condition that he spend 40 hours learning woodworking from a certified craftsperson. The estate would go to Lester as trustee, with any remaining funds at my death distributed to the Tucson Community Vocational Center, which ran carpentry programs for at-risk youth. I did not leave my daughter anything except a written copy of her mother's letter. Judge Pruitt denied the guardianship petition with prejudice. In the hallway afterward, Lester leaned against the wall and exhaled slowly. His hands were shaking slightly. "Harold," he said. "You did good," I told him. "In there and 30 years ago when you showed up at my hardware store in the rain." He didn't say anything, just nodded, looking at the floor. The criminal case moved more slowly. The Pima County attorney filed charges against Vanessa and Cliff: financial elder abuse, fraud, theft by deception, and, for Vanessa specifically, reckless endangerment for the medication tampering. The medication charge carried up to 12 years. Vanessa hired a private defense attorney. Cliff hired a different one. They stopped speaking to each other within a week of the charges being filed, which told me something about what their marriage had actually been. Cliff made a deal first. He pleaded to 2 counts of financial fraud and agreed to cooperate fully, which meant testifying against Vanessa on the medication charge and the POA scheme. The mortgage was being unwound by the title company. I would keep my house. Vanessa's trial took 4 months. Her attorney argued that the medication substitution had been Cliff's idea, that she'd been unaware, that she was as much a victim as I was. Cliff's testimony made that argument difficult to sustain. The pharmacist confirmed the prescription had been dispensed correctly. Dr. Okafor testified about the pills. The financial record showed the account where the mortgage money had been transferred was in Vanessa's name only. The jury deliberated for 2 days. Guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to 7 years. The judge cited the deliberate nature of the medical interference, the planning involved, the use of a family relationship to establish access. She noted that the victim had been recovering from a stroke at the time of the original fraud. She did not look sympathetic. I was not in the courtroom for the sentencing. I had been there for the verdict, but I asked Lester to represent me at sentencing. Some things you don't need to watch. 1 year later, the workshop stands open most mornings now. I replaced the padlock with nothing, just a door that swings wide and lets in the February light. Lester has office space in the front room. He handles elder law cases out of Tucson, and he started a small nonprofit that connects seniors facing financial abuse with pro bono attorneys. He named it the Morrison Program, after Lorraine's maiden name. I didn't ask him to do that. He just did it. My grandson visits on Saturdays. He's 10 now, and he's been learning to use a hand plane and a miter saw, supervised and careful and completely in love with the smell of sawdust. The roll-top desk is almost finished. We've been working on it together, and I think it's better for the collaboration. There are small imperfections in the joinery where his hands did the work, and I've decided those are my favorite parts. My daughter-in-law in Florence, Arizona, 30 minutes from where she grew up. I wrote her a letter 6 months after the sentencing. Not to forgive her. I don't think forgiveness is something you declare. I think it's something that happens slowly over time, whether you intended to or not. I wrote to tell her that her mother had loved her, that Lorraine had covered for her once out of love and died carrying the weight of it, that her son asked about her sometimes. And I didn't lie to him, but I tried to be honest in a way that left room for who she might become. She hasn't written back. That's all right. The letter wasn't for me to get something. It was because Lorraine would have wanted it sent. Some mornings I sit in the workshop doorway with my coffee while the desert turns from gray to gold. And I think about the chain of things, how a man hiring a wet and desperate stranger on a November morning 30 years ago became the reason that same man was standing in my driveway on a February morning when I had $43 and nowhere to go. How kindness moves forward through time in ways you can't see or plan for. How Lorraine was right about consequences and right about love, and how both things can be true at once. My grandson knocked over a jar of wood stain last Saturday and looked at me with that particular horror children have when they've broken something they think is irreplaceable. I told him what Lorraine used to tell me: wood absorbs things. That's why it's warm, sanded down, and it holds the mark, but it doesn't break. He nodded like he understood. Maybe he did. We went back to work. I keep thinking about the chain of things, not in a mystical way, just in the plain, observable way that one choice leads to another, and eventually the whole shape of a life becomes visible. Like a piece of furniture you've been building in the dark, and only see clearly when you finally turn the light on. 12 years ago, I hired a man who was sitting on a curb in the rain because he looked like someone who needed a hand, and I had one to give. I didn't think about it much. It cost me nothing but a little time and a willingness to see past the surface of someone who hadn't gotten their footing yet. Lester went on to build a life I couldn't have predicted. And 12 years later, he was sitting on a bench outside a hospital at the exact moment I needed someone to sit there with me. You can call that coincidence. I call it the long math of decent behavior finally coming due. And then there's the other side of it. My daughter spent years taking small liberties, a credit card, a key, a refilled prescription, and each time nothing happened. Each time the world absorbed it and moved on, Lorraine covered for her once out of love, and in doing so accidentally taught her that the cost of a bad choice could always be paid by someone else. That lesson compounded quietly for 20 years until Vanessa was standing in my kitchen with a brochure for an assisted living facility, genuinely surprised that I wasn't going along with it. She'd been trained by a lifetime of soft landings. She didn't know how to calculate for consequences because no one had ever made her. That's not a condemnation of Lorraine. My wife was the most decent person I've known, and she made that decision from love, which is the most understandable reason in the world to make a mistake. But love without the willingness to let someone feel the weight of what they've done isn't really protecting them. It's just deferring the damage. What I learned, slowly, sitting in that workshop doorway with my coffee while my grandson asked me questions about wood grain, is that integrity isn't a feeling. It's a practice. It's what you do when you're tired and nobody's watching, and the easier thing is right in front of you. Lester had it at 38, broke and sleeping on the edge of nothing, showing up to work every day because that's who he decided to be. My daughter lost it incrementally, one small rationalization at a time, until she was standing in a courtroom and couldn't find her way back. And I had to learn to use my own, Because there's a version of me that covers for Vanessa the way Lorraine did, that takes the anger and the grief and the betrayal and folds it quietly into a drawer because she's my daughter and it's easier not to look. I felt the pull of that. Standing in the hallway after the verdict, I felt it strongly. But Lorraine left me a letter for a reason. She didn't want me to carry what she'd carried. She wanted me to know that real love sometimes means not catching someone when they fall. Because the fall, as terrible as it is the only thing that might finally teach them to stand. My grandson knocked over a jar of wood stain last Saturday and looked up at me with that particular horror kids have when they've broken something. I told him what I've come to believe. The grain of things absorbs what happens to them. That's not a weakness. Sand it down, work it through, and the mark becomes part of the strength. He nodded. We went back to work.